My guest today is Professor Prof-Collins Ifeonu. He is an assistant professor in the Sociology and Anthropology department at Simon Fraser University. It's not often that I get a professor whose actual name is Prof. It's wild, right? I'm curious though, as an art that studies the society, I'm interested in sort of the unique perspective. How has society changed through your lens as a sociologist in over the last 20 years?
That's a fantastic question. I mean, society is always changing, right? And you can think about, this in various ways. For example, next week I'm going to teach on, in one of my classes, I'm going to teach about like mass media and just the way that mass media has shaped, the way that we consume news, the way that we consume pop culture. We have the rise of streaming and podcasting, which I think has revolutionized the way that we consume news, the way that we consume, culture, so to speak, or I would say pop culture. You can think about the way that podcasting has changed, news media, podcasting in relation to, the radio. This is just one area, just looking at social media and looking at all the changes that have occurred. You can think about social media in relation to print media. You can think about the rise of influencers, that are in themselves, brands, like the rise of a Kai Cenat or the rise of, of DJ academics and so on. Like these are all people that they are their own brands. They've changed. They've fundamentally, like whether we like it or not, DJ academics has fundamentally changed the way that, or people like DJ academics, who themselves are a product of the streaming and the podcasting, revolution of mass media. They've fundamentally changed the way that we consume hip hop, right? So these are just a few changes like that that I could think of on a societal level. I also think I would say maybe one other change that I could speak to, just again sticking with media. I think that maybe just the level of media literacy, if I could say that, has increased like exponentially when we think about the rise of like smartphones and various kinds of smartphones, right? It's not just the iPhone. It's, I come from Nigeria where, this phone company called Techno is incredibly popular, right? And they sell, really affordable smartphones that provide the same access to WhatsApp and Twitter and Facebook as an iPhone does. So the average person is way more media savvy, right, than I would say growing up where, I was in school and, we had to line up to use the internet. Yeah. You know what I mean? Or you had to pay a certain amount of money to get into, to use, to go to a cyber cafe and use, log into the internet and just look at your email for like 20, 30 minutes, before deciding on something else. There's so many changes that we can speak to.
This is a political podcast a lot of times. And I want to know how you feel like politics and the way we relate to politics has changed over that period of time as well.
It's hard to answer this question without referencing social media, because social media has become something of a battleground. Depending on what side of the aisle what side of the ideological spectrum that you fall under, right? Your algorithms are somewhat curated to align with your political interest, right? So if you tweet or retweet something, or you like a post, that tilts slightly in one direction or the other, it's not a coincidence that then you get subsequent related posts that seem, in line with your own what the algorithm believes is your political, is your political leaning. So when I think about that, I just think about, how again, you could also say that maybe that puts us in echo chambers of some sort, but then again, that's kind of how these algorithms work. I think that if I could speak to just how media has changed, the way that we consume politics, I would say that now more than ever, I'll just give an example of myself, right? Like, I've had my I've had my Twitter or X profile for close to 20 years now, right? It has been it's been nurtured and curated to my interests over time, right? And I always tell my friends that if I that if there's something going on in the world that I need to know, there's a high chance that I'm going to that news will come to me first
Yeah.
on my
Yeah.
X account, right? No matter what it is. Um, it has in some ways it's kind of some would perhaps at some points maybe there were fears that the rise of social media would somewhat kill off or dwindle interest in
And it
traditional
has.
media,
And
whether
it
it's
has. I mean,
newspapers or
yeah.
and it has, yeah, I would say so. I don't have I don't have the numbers to evidence this here, but I'm sure that there has been there's been a fundamental shift there. For me personally, what social media does for me is that it prompts me to things, right? It prompts me. So for example, I find out, oh, there has been I don't know, there's been an earthquake in XY country, right? So it prompts me, it gives me the heads up that, hey, something's happened here. And then what I then do is I then go digging. So I then go to the news
Yeah, you're
channels. I
better
might
than
go to the
most of us. You're
CBC
better than most of
or
us, man. Like most people are just like,
yeah.
oh, look at the headline. That happened in XY country, like you said. That sucks. That is all. Move on to the doom scroll to the next thing. That's what happens. You said
Right.
you actually said you go and actually you actually dig deeper. Whoa, who is this man? No. Nobody does that.
The caveat is if something interests me. So it's not. So I imagine that maybe out of 98 things that I come across, maybe on a daily basis on my timeline, two things interest me enough that I then make the effort to go, to go searching for more information.
The reason why I asked, especially in relation to politics, is obviously the algorithm also reinforces the channel I try to run here is one that allows people from different ends of the political spectrum to have discussions, right? But what I found there is that you're always fighting the algorithm because the algorithm finds it simpler to put people in, okay, you're on the left, you're on the right. And I found that one of the big changes I think I've noticed is politicians are very eager to reinforce that, to reinforce the polarization, right? So I was wondering how you would why is polarization such a useful thing as a person who studies the society and that kind of perspective? Why is polarization such a useful and easy tool, for that matter, for politicians to use?
I think that politics is inherently oppositional, and politics is always about sides. Like it's an inherently um, it's an inherently adversarial endeavor, if I can put it that way. So I don't know if I would say I would I guess I don't know if I would say that polarization in the current it's just the polarization is a bit it's more amplified because of the means by which it's being done, like, but I think inherently politics is always about it's about it's about dividing. It's about one person trying to one up the other and sort of trying to curry the attention or garner the support of the masses because they believe that whatever strategies or whatever ideologies or um, whatever plans they have, so to speak, are the right one. They are the ideal one, and it's about making yourself. It's about articulating yourself as the solution and articulating others as the problem or less of the solution.
My understanding of people is that people are inherently nuanced, right? You can't. It's hard. Most people, I would say, are not people that would say, okay, I agree with everything on the left. Everything there checks every box for me. But more and more politicians are pushing people towards those extremes where they have to either take the entire package, they can't be somewhere in the middle. And I guess what I'm trying to understand is why does that work from like a society perspective? What is it about our dynamics as a society that makes that so effective?
Well, I mean, I would say a lot of it has to do with resources, right? Resources are finite. Let's just say we don't, as a society, we don't all have equal access to resources, right? The resources that we need to go about our daily lives, whether it's in terms of, money in our pockets to take care of ourselves and our families and our loved ones, money to enhance our lives, housing, shelter, security, healthcare, and so on and so forth. These things are not as readily accessible to all members of society, right? And you have situations, and I think this goes back to the previous answer that I gave, in the sense that, every politician is trying to position themselves as most ideal to provide this. In a general sense, every politician is trying to position themselves as the best person to provide these, resources. And I think about resources as expansively as you can, right? And in order to do that, they have to compete with others. And in competing with others, one has to kind of poke holes in the other person's arguments, or wants to poke holes in the other person's manifesto, or has to poke holes in the other person's strategies. And so the game goes. I just think that we happen to be in a unique moment now where, again, I do think that if I do not have the statistics offhand, but I mean that wealth inequality in has never been, I guess on a world scale, has not been as stark as it is today. I mean, there was a Statistics Canada report from 2 years ago that showed that, I think either last year or 2 years ago, that the average Canadian cannot afford, an unforeseen bill of more than $500, right? So that just gives you a sense of the population and, the, you know, I guess the tightness in the air, and I think that polarization would be less potent if resources were more, readily available to all members of the public in ways that, folks didn't have to, contend, or didn't have to latch on to one or the other's political messages as a solution
Yeah,
to set
yeah.
problems,
So
right?
actually, maybe this is a good question to ask you. So based on that, do you believe in a more socialist type of economy as against a socialist economy in the sense that we try and take care of everybody, reduce, everybody or raise everybody's floor essentially, so people are able to sustain a bit better even if they're not all the way well off, right? That's the inherently the basis of socialism, right? I know Donald Trump might probably call that communism, but that's besides the point. But as against like the inherently socialist economy, as against a capitalist economy, which is coincidentally sort of the weird transition that Canada is facing right now, where Justin Trudeau, as our former prime minister, was a bit more focused on social programs, on programs to kind of like help the poorest among or the most vulnerable among us. Whereas it would seem that Marconi is a bit more focused on growing the economy, as he has admitted, and maybe while he's preserving some of those programs, as you might have seen in his recent budgets, he's not expanding them in a way maybe you might expect Justin Trudeau to do. He's more focused on the economy, and the inherently capitalist ideals of maybe trying to grow an economy, because part of the manifesto for Marconi is getting a lot of private investors into the economy to invest a certain amount of money and that kind of thing. Which of these systems would you say is better for Canada?
Well, that's a great question. I would say that in terms of just answering your first question about where where I lie on that spectrum, I think that I personally believe that we that a running society has to cater to its less privileged elements, right? Like that, in order for us to exist, you know, hospitably with each other, right? That we do we do hold a responsibility to look after those who are not in the most privileged positions, right? Whether that's by I mean, let's just maybe I'll just speak in the context of an example, right? So last year I lost a very dear friend to stage 4 cancer, and you know uh, and this person this person beat it first, and the first time, and then it came back, and unfortunately they couldn't beat it the second time. And I remember I was having a conversation with this person after they beat it the first time, and they told me, pretty much if I was if I lived in the States, that I would be dead, right? Because I just wouldn't be able to afford, the chemotherapy, the treatments, right? So the treatments that I got here for free in Canada, I would not have had access to it in if I lived elsewhere. And I think for me, that speaks to just the idea of catering to the collective good. I think that we are not all equally positioned to take advantage of or to be as prosperous as we can be. But I do think that we are positioned to help those in society who are not as privileged, who are not in as privileged of a position as others. Now, as for, I can't speak with much expertise about Carney's, specific, policies. But what I can say is that I think that, a society that caters to the quote unquote the little guy is one that has a far more robust, or maybe not robust, but I think it's a society that is more. I think it's a society that is more equipped to to exist in something of a harmonious state. And I know it might sound that might sound a little bit flowery.
Does sound a little flowery in
I'm
these times,
sure.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it sounds flowery. Yeah, and of course, these are debates that have taken place for decades. I mean, not just decades, for centuries, about what the best way to run a society is. But I just happen to lie on the part of, okay, for example, I believe in a welfare state. I believe in the idea of a
Interesting. You're gonna
welfare
get
state.
some
I believe in the
flack for that
idea.
though, in the audience. But carry on, carry on, carry on.
Yeah, I do believe in yeah, I would say that. I would say that, um, and again, this is not, this doesn't. Of course, folks are welcome to disagree. I have these discussions in my classes, so these are not things that I'm alien to. But I do believe that I think that if we have the understanding that we are not all equally positioned to take advantage of, what's the word? To take advantage of of life's, if we're not all equally positioned to be prosperous, so to speak, then I believe that, I believe that, having a welfare state that, again, that does things like that has things like through initiatives like universal healthcare. I think that is something that should be like a basic, human rights, a basic, responsibility um, that um, that should be something that the basic rights that everyone has, regardless of how much money is
Yeah.
in their pocket.
So I think, and I want to say that a lot of Canadians probably agree with a lot of that, but also we live in times right now where, well, you might have heard, but times are tough. you know, people are struggling with paying their bills right now. Food is not terribly affordable. Unemployment is pretty high at the moment, although it came down last month. So people are struggling. People are really struggling, and on the one hand, and this is the fundamental problem that the prime minister has to deal with right now, where people need support, and so speaking to that, the social welfare perspective that you were saying, people need support, but also they also need to work on growing this economy so that people are not always unemployed and needing a handout in order to survive, right? Which is really fundamentally the debates that this discussion is part of what is going on in the House of Commons right now, where a person like so at some point the school food program was presented, and the Conservatives voted against the school food program, and their perspective is that, well, you're trying to pass a law where you want to keep giving people free food. The idea there is essentially that kids should not have to go hungry, especially in these tough times where parents might have uncertain circumstances, right? And the county government took a move to try and make that permanent. But on the other hand, the Conservatives in their argument are saying, well, fix the economy, make it so their parents are not unemployed. So their parents would like to feed their own kids. So that's really some of the fundamental debates that are going on. And I think that right now the side of the debate that's winning is one where people are saying, yeah, we got to grow this economy.
I understand that, and I appreciate, just in terms with respect to the particular debates that you're speaking to. I guess I don't see those two priorities as mutually exclusive. Of course, there needs to be a growing economy or a healthy economy that should be grown and should be nurtured. But I also think that you also have to cater to the immediate term, if you know what I mean. Like, if we are going by the idea that, if we're going by, the stats that I just spoke of from Statistics Canada, that the average Canadian can't afford, an unforeseen bill of $500 or more, right? I doubt that's a product of a mass unwillingness to work or to apply oneself. I see that that's more of a systemic challenge, right? But then how do you solve that issue in the immediate term, and how do you solve that issue in the medium to long term? Of course, that's a product of, okay, we do need to grow the economy, but then how do we preserve our population in the immediate term, right? Like, I guess I'm not on the side that, and I don't think that, I do not want to misrepresent anyone's arguments, but if somebody, we saw this during COVID, right? Where, because of COVID, the economy was kind of plunged into, was plunged into a state of crisis, and there were a number of recovery plans, through immigration, through various stimulus packages and so on, right? These are just things that a country does to keep itself ticking over and to keep its citizens ticking over, right? To prevent further chaos. The school food program, people would want to. I'm sure if you ask parents who are, I'm sure if you did a survey, for example, and you spoke to parents who are reliant on these sorts of programs, I doubt that any one of them wants to be, I doubt any of them wants to be entirely dependent on it. It's a matter of need, right? So I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that I don't see those two priorities as mutually exclusive. I think maybe in how they
jump in though.
Go ahead.
The thing here is, you spoke about scarce resources before, right? And Canada is in a situation where you could argue we're really on a shoestring right now in terms of, I'm sure you've heard about the big deficit in McCartney's budget, $78 billion, I think it was. And so Canada is spending, to use the words from the Conservative Party, spending on a credit card right now, right? And so the decision then has to be made, and this is where maybe it seems like some people, maybe with more conservative ideals, are like, I work hard, I pay my taxes, I shouldn't have to be struggling like this, grow the economy, because you have to then allocate these scarce funds, because the money you've put to social programs is not really, for the most part, probably doesn't return to you as direct, like, dividends or direct profits, essentially, right? But if you invest in programs and infrastructure and stuff that will potentially, you know, bring returns, you know, but you were saying how they're not mutually exclusive. They can be when you consider that there are scarce Canadian taxpayer dollars to spend on these things, right? And then the government has to make that decision in every bit of time to decide, okay, what makes sense to prioritize going forward.
Okay, so I understand that, and I think I get it in sort of hard material terms where, okay, the money that's being spent on, and of course we don't need to get hung up on this, but like, if the money that's being spent on resource, the money that's being spent on these programs, you know, some may argue could be better used to, you know, make investments that you say yield dividends. But I also see the money but then I also see the money that's being spent on these school programs as an investment in themselves, right? I see them as you investing in the population. I see that you investing in young minds or in feeding, you know, families and nurturing young minds who hopefully in the next, maybe it might, like I said, in the immediate term, it might not yield the adequate return, right? But you are investing in minds and you're investing in, you know, in nurturing, you're investing in nurturing, you know, children or yeah, you're investing in children of the next generation, so to speak. So that in itself is an investment, right? A country that I would see it that way, right? So again, that's why I said I don't see these two. I don't see these two. I don't see these two priorities as mutually exclusive. I see them as investments. I think maybe what the difference is here is how, I guess, how some of these, you know, some of these initiatives are framed, you know, and positioned in the public imagination, so to speak.
Yeah.
Okay.
So now I want to switch gears, and you're teaching in a particularly interesting time now where AI is a really big thing, and I want to know how that comes into the classroom, how you've experienced, what kind of experiences you've had with AI in your classroom.
I think that I was actually listening to was it last year? No, it was earlier this year. I was listening to a BBC Focus on Africa podcast, and there were a couple of professors from the University of Pretoria that were talking about how like AI has fundamentally changed the way people teach, changed the attitude to teaching and assessments. To speak about how I've seen it like make inroads in higher education. I mean, you have these models that are, you know, that are geared towards, you know, writing, you know, academic essays. You can put in a prompt and say, hey, could you write me a 6,000 word essay on the history of life, and it produces that, or something close to what it thinks, you know, a sociology essay at the 200, you know, at the 200 level on the history of life, you know, would contain, with references and so on. Some of those references are hallucinated. So now more than ever, it's proving increasingly more difficult to, for example, try to show students the value of critical writing or critical thinking expressed through writing, right? That I always tell my students that being a critical writer or writing critically makes you a better thinker, right? And this is why you put in that time into like articulating yourself rather than outsourcing that to a language model that's going to produce what it thinks is critical thinking, but it's really, you know, it's kind of, and also another thing is that you know how the AI model writes, because it writes it can be a little bit bland, and it's bland. It's very, you know, it's like on spiced chicken. You know what I mean? It's
yeah.
It's on spiced chicken. I would say I've never. Sometimes I crave a typo. You know, like I'm craving for something that shows me that, okay, this still shows that there's a human element to this. You know what I mean? I think those things matter, right? I mean, I was talking to a friend a few weeks ago, And he was telling me that like even in like discussions like with students, right? Just regular discussions that you'd have in class, that you would ask questions and a student would input a student would input your question into, ChatGPT or something, and then get an answer and then
Wow.
say it back to you, right? So it's infiltrated pretty much every aspect of the teaching slash learning experience.
Now, I want to clarify though, what is the
Yeah.
policy currently in most of the, at least from maybe in your university, or what is the policy on use of AI in academic in classes and assignments, those kinds of things?
The policy right now, at least at my university, is that the university has left it to the discretion of the instructors.
Okay.
So my courses involve a lot of writing. It's kind of hard to get away from that. Right, mixture of writing and exams and presentations. So I would say for the past 2 semesters, I have had a, kind of a no tolerance policy for the use of, ChatGPT to write your essays. And I tell students, this is because of what this course is trying to achieve in terms of helping you become, better writers, helping you express your thoughts and whatnot through writing. So I would say at around the start of last year, I didn't have an explicit policy around, the use of AI and so on, right? Because I just kind of believe that I'm not I tell my students that I'm not a cop, right? Like I'm not. My goal is I want to teach you. I want to learn. I want to teach you, but I also want to learn with you, and I'm not here to police you, right? But I also found that, I was reading a lot of essays that I could tell were just written by AI. And it's kind of hard to provide feedback to a student over something that, they either didn't write fully or maybe they didn't write at all.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's kind of like, it's like, have you ever tried to have like a conversation with like sometimes when I want to if I want to get access to like a bank or something and I'm chatting with an online bot, I keep saying I want to speak to an advisor. I want to speak to an advisor. I just keep typing that until I get to an actual agent. You know what I mean? Because unless it's like a very typical request that I have that can be answered in an FAQ or something, I just want to speak to somebody who I feel, it just feels more relational. So it's a difficult experience grading a paper that either hasn't been fully written or has only been partially written by the student. There's something a bit more obvious about the use of AI in essay writing and so on that kind of just brings to that the kind of, for me, I think it contradicts the ethos of some of the skills that I am trying to instill in my teaching and just in my overall, like, quote unquote, pedagogical approach.
I think that's an important foundation for students. I'll tell you why, and maybe you can speak to this because I know you have your background in HR as well. And increasingly, some of my HR friends have told me that a lot of the cover letters they see these days are AI written, right? And I mean, obviously, from the perspective of the applicants, it's like, you put out 500 applications, maybe you hear back from 2 or 5 if you're lucky, or maybe a little bit more if you're a bit more specialized, And so for them, for the applicants looking for these jobs is about efficiency. It's a game of numbers for them. Maybe they take a kind of a strategic approach just to like cast the wide nets like that. But at the same time, these HR people are going, if I see another cover letter. So in fact, I'm hearing that some HR people don't even read cover letters anymore. They just, they look at your resume and they're done. And it occurs to me that, it's good to have these foundations, as you say, in your sociology classes, for people to actually like learn the art of writing and those kinds of things.
At this point, I don't see, it's one that I'm still thinking about. I wrestle with this every semester. I wrestle with what kinds of assessments I want to give and how I will grapple with this. Mind you, this was not an issue that people were talking about really 3 years ago, right? So the manner in which this has spread or has diffused across across various institutions, academia, and so on. It's quite rapid. It's rapid. It's happened almost overnight. So it's still something that I'm grappling with. I really don't know at this point. I don't know. Maybe you can give me some
Yeah.
pointers.
I'm in the, as you might know, I'm a scientist, so our relationship to AI is
Mm-hmm.
slightly different to what you might have in the arts in terms of like the creative requirements,
Mm-hmm.
So the way I might engage with
Okay.
AI is trying to maybe sometimes. I think my biggest concern with, and you might know I've had some experience with teaching as well, but my experience with
Mm-hmm.
young scientists coming up is the fact that they are outsourcing that ability to break down problems into like the fundamental building blocks when we're trying to attack a problem. And so,
Mm.
when you get into the industry like I am now, you find people that needs like AI to think through solutions for them, right? Now, there
Mm-hmm.
are useful points where maybe maybe someone who is lacking in a certain skill, maybe let's say coding is a skill that they're not particularly good at. Well,
Mm-hmm.
before you would have to learn that code to be able to apply that skill, right? Now you get ChatGPT is
Mm-hmm.
able to basically make that job easier for you. Say in the data science part of
Mm-hmm.
what we do, where you have to analyze big data, you can get AI essentially to write a code to do that for you, right? To write Python codes, pages and pages of Python codes for you. And for us, that introduces newfound efficiencies, allows us to dedicate brain power
Mm.
to do something else, which, in some cases is beneficial, but it also means that when the AI does something wrong, a lot of people who have not trained in the fundamentals of some of these things are not able to kind of go in and actually pinpoint where it's gone wrong, right? Because you're essentially taking exactly what it's
Mm-hmm.
giving
Mm-hmm.
you. So in the sciences, we have a slightly different relationship. It's long and short of what it is.
Okay. Okay. So let me ask you then, because I have these conversations with my brother a lot. And my brother reminded me that when the calculator was introduced several years ago, that there was a similar level of hysteria
Your
to what
brother's not
there is
100 years
now,
old, is he?
around, the
It's just
use.
like when the calculator was
No, no.
invented. That's not like something like the 100-year-old might say. But carry on, sorry.
Yeah, so he said there was a similar level of hysteria around the introduction of the calculator and how that would infringe on or how that would dilute um, people's, mathematical abilities, so to speak, right? Um, And what we have seen, obviously, over time is the calculator doesn't. Um, the calculator, you still have to learn. You have to learn how to use the calculator. It hasn't replaced the skill set. It's merely just augmented what is or isn't
Yeah.
there, if you know what I mean, right? Should we? Sorry,
No,
this is me
carry
asking
on.
you, kind of switching roles around for a bit, but like, do you think that we are in? Do you think that we should think about AI in a similar way. You know what I
Well,
mean?
I want to say AI is slightly different to what a calculator was, in the sense that
Hmm.
you still have to know, with a calculator you have to know what numbers to plug in. You have to know how to
Hmm.
work with those numbers to get the answers that you're looking for. But in the case of AI is designed to tell you how to work with those numbers, right? In that sense, I think it's
Hmm.
fundamentally different, where you know it does create the opportunity where you can then build on the ability to work with those numbers and use it to create something tremendously unexpected, right? That is the benefit of AI.
Hmm.
But I think it's like maybe
Hmm.
slightly it's to me the way I see it is slightly different to a calculator. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and that's what I tell my brother. I'm like, this is it's like
Yeah.
comparing apples and oranges. This is not it's not an
No,
equal
I
comparison
don't, I
as
don't
you've
think
just
it is.
established.
But as I said, though, as I find in the sciences, it is going to fundamentally change the way our efficiencies in science. I think we are probably going to be the ones to benefit probably the most from it.
The
Just
most.
some of the, I mean, in drug discovery, for example, now people are looking for ways to cut down the pipeline of drug discovery, which previously would have taken
Mm-hmm.
years or something to go through figuring out what is active for a certain as a certain therapeutic before you get to the human trials. And now
Mm-hmm.
they're finding ways to use AI to
Yeah.
fundamentally constrict that, right? Even in the social
Mm-hmm.
sciences, I know, for example, I'll bring this back to politics, where the government is looking for ways to use AI to make their service delivery a bit more efficient. Um, I want to understand how different are the issues that international students from different parts of the world, how different are the issues that they face in integrating into Canada's education and labor market. So essentially, I want you to compare the experience from your perception of African students to maybe Asian students to European students.
Okay. I think that it's a really excellent question because it gets at the heart of what I see as one of the central messages of my current research agenda, which is that international students are not a monolith, that this is a diverse group. They're diverse in terms of their challenges, they're diverse in terms of their integration experiences, they're diverse in terms of just some of the ways that they adapt to their educational and their life experience in Canada and other parts of the world. So you have students from sub-Saharan Africa who are dealing with, you know, just grappling with the racial dynamics of living in a society like Canada or the United States and so on, right? So these are students who maybe prior to moving, living in a country where it's majority quote unquote black or so on, right? And then coming to understand, and not really seeing themselves sort of in racial terms, right? And what that transnational movement um, from the home country to the host country, how that then, and then through experiences like, through exposure to experiences of like, discrimination and so on, how that then, there's a whole like, there's a whole line of scholarship on how they say blackness is not something that you are, it's something that you become, right? If we start to disaggregate the international student population and we start looking at various trends and we start looking at various experiences, right, with even the idea of the international student itself, it's very much shaped by um, who we imagine is popularly an international student. So, for example, because they were the two biggest sending countries for decades, right? Chinese and Indian students are popularly seen as international students. That also shapes the way that we see, and some of those those labels and those assumptions are applied to domestic students. So you have Chinese domestic, or sorry, you have Canadian students of Chinese origin, of Chinese background, or you have, Canadian students of Indian background that are automatically assumed to be international students, right? Because we've imagined that international students tend to either be Chinese or Indian, right? So, and this shapes everything to do from like just your lived experience, how you navigate the world, what kinds of issues you face, what kinds of opportunities are, you know, whether you assumed, sometimes I've had experiences in the past where I've had like domestic students, that's Canadian students of Chinese background that will say, well, I've had people like ask me, whether I speak English or something like that. But I was actually born in Canada. Like I don't need some students have actually never been back to China or India, but because through their physical appearance, they're automatically assumed to be an international student, and they're they're automatically assumed to be foreign, right? So these are just so the idea is that once we look a little bit closer, we start to understand some of the variations
How
in this
is
group
how is this
just
experience
along
different from? I think you
so
touched a
on.
little bit on students from Africa. You touched a little bit on students from Asia. How is this
Right,
experience different from for
right.
students maybe coming from international students still, but who come from Europe or who might come from the United States, for example?
Um, Again, it's not really about where the student comes from. It's about how basic some physical markers, right? How it kind of and some of the assumptions that are ascribed
Let
to
me
those
rephrase
physical
then.
markers. So, for
How
example,
is the experience different
okay,
for a white person? Or that's what I meant when I said European. But I understand that we live
hmm
in a very uh, non-homogeneous world right now where you're right, Europeans
hmm
might not look as we expect Europeans to look now. But I mean, how is this?
hmm
You've spoken about the impact of blackness in the way students integrate into Canada's educational labor market. You've talked about how
right,
Asian students of Chinese descent, even if they're not necessarily from China,
hmm
and Indian students
hmm
incorporate, and the perception, we've all heard this, that every time people go
hmm
to like a McDonald's or Tim Hortons and they see an Indian person, they automatically assume these are immigrants or international students or that kind of stuff.
hmm
So I
hmm
guess what I wanted to contrast there is how that experience or your perception of whether that experience is different for students that would be white. Exactly, is what I meant by European.
We know that like discrimination exists in the workplace. We know there's statistical evidence that shows like the racial disparities in workplace, in recruitment, and so on and so forth, right? And I think that these kinds of these notions about who is seen as belonging or not belonging and everything in between, it shapes ideas of fit. It shapes your ideas of who is seen as an ideal worker, who is seen as somebody who will stay. It shapes ideas of even things like pay gaps. It shapes how much a person's starting salary is based on these notions. So I'm not. This is not to say that like I'm not trying to say that like that international students as a whole group, they're not issues that pertain to them in general. And there's so many other factors that come into this, whether it's nation of origin, whether it's racial status, whether it's and even gender and so on and so forth. But I do think that, again, if I'm going by some of the things that, international students, for example, I know that even the idea of, how would I put this? I know that, for example, in the way that some visible minorities are marked as foreign just by the way that like it's assumed that you're from somewhere else, even if you may be born here, right? Some international students who come from like Western Europe or some international students who come from the States are not marked in the same way, right? It's more of a it now becomes more about immigration status and whatnot. But those sort of subtle cultural barriers that some of the folks that I've just spoken about have to jump over, they're not as potent of an issue for, I would say, like a student who is
Yeah,
coming from America or a white international who is
yeah.
coming from
I
America.
have.
That doesn't, and again, that's not to say that there aren't issues that are uniform across the board, right?
And speaking of racialized outcomes, I wonder how do you feel about
Yeah.
and this is a talk. This has been kind of a hot debate online about the validity, if you like, of DEI policies, diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, which would seek to to help minorities get into the workforce, get into the education system, those kinds of things. Do you what is your perception of the place of DEI in the world? Let me keep it general.
That affirmative action for me is not a new phenomenon. It's something that has always existed. I believe that there's a book by a scholar who I believe is the I think there's actually an abridged version of the book, or at least either an article in the Atlantic or the New Yorker. It's called the Affirmative Action Puzzle, right? And from a U.S. perspective, he kind of goes through the history of DEI policies, of various kinds of affirmative action policy. I believe in that book, it stated that, like affirmative action is something that has always existed as a form of like reparative, as a corrective for various, historical injustices, right? My position on it is that I believe that if we understand that there are, structural barriers like those that, that if we believe that, not everybody has an equal shot at certain things, not an equal shot at getting certain jobs, getting into certain roles, I do believe that at a certain point there has to be a policy in place that tries to level that out in a way. I don't see it as a matter of, somebody, kind of skiving off or nicking or nicking a living or getting in. If we understand what's, I think the my opinion on this is it's really shaped by whether we understand inequalities as a matter of one's individual capacities or something that exists on a much more structural scale, of which individuals are either are positioned either to benefit or to lose out, right? And I think that these policies, I think that they level. I think that for me, I think that they have a role in leveling the playing field, or at least attempting to level the playing field in some capacity. Because if we believe that we are not all equally positioned, then as a society, then I think that some of these policies are designed to level that out, in some way.
When you consider that, and I mean, this is a feature that you kind of, it's getting a lot of pushback now, where in the process of correcting historical injustices, as you say, a lot of my white friends maybe who are poor right now will say, well, there are no historical advantages for me, right? I come from a poor background, and you're saying, okay, this person, maybe because they're black, maybe because they're indigenous in the case of Canada, and maybe some United States or places like Australia, where they have, or New Zealand, where they have like an indigenous population. Why should these people of different historical disadvantages have a leg up over me, who is arguably coming from a place of disadvantage as well? And that is sort of the pushback that I've been seeing in sort of the zeitgeist now against like DEI policies, for example.
Those concerns are valid to the extent that we should be catering for those who are not equally positioned, right? Maybe there need to be more programs that are, not just targeted around, race, but also looking at things like income level. Again, like my understanding of like affirmative action policies is that these things have precedents. Like, for example, there are scholarships that exist at Simon Fraser University that specifically targets like low income students, low income communities, right? And there's a whole process there's a process to determine if one person is to determine if one qualifies, just in the same way that there's a process to determine whether one is eligible for welfare, right? Like there are similar policies that exist in that in that regard. For me, I don't see that as a fault of the policy that is targeting or that is trying to repair one wrong. There are many wrongs that are in place here, right? And there are many issues that need to be addressed. And I see it more as a case of, okay, then maybe we should think about someone who has dealt with historically entrenched poverty. That should be the focus of targeted intervention. I don't see that as a case of then like turning inwards and attacking, or turning inwards or having a negative view of a program that is designed to target one or a specific form or specific forms of historical injustices. Poverty is not and this is it, and maybe some may disagree with me. It's a structural condition, right? Like it's not maybe it's a structural condition that for me requires structural interventions, right? At my university, there are specific scholarship programs that target all kinds of specialties and areas of research, right? There might be funds that are targeted, that are focused on, that are targeted towards studies in the Northwest Territories, right? Or there might be focus on research targeting, Latin America or Sub-Saharan Africa and so on, right? Neither one of these they don't need to compete with each other because it's all important, right? So maybe our focus can go towards, kind of understanding this on a wider scale and understanding the need for maybe multiple kinds of interventions than say, maybe focusing on one and thinking that this one is coming at the expense of the other.
Maybe perhaps the only pushback, and I know you've told me in the beginning of this interview that you believe in a welfare state. And I told you you're going to get a little bit of pushback online for that, but besides the point.
Yeah, can I just caveat that, because I think my belief in a welfare state is also shaped. It's not just like an academic endeavor, right? I'm also shaped by lived experience. I'm shaped by the lived experiences of not just close friends and family, like the person who I told you was a cancer survivor, but eventually, succumbed to the disease. It's also shaped by my own background and coming from a context where I feel like some of these supports are genuinely needed, maybe at a more serious level than I would say here in Canada. Just speaking out of turn, I do think that life is expensive, and and there are certain just basic needs that one should be able to have, without feeling like, it's not something that should be, I don't know, it's not like just like you don't earn the right to breathe air. You know what I mean? Like there are certain fundamental building blocks that should be in place for a healthy society to run, right? And my experience of this is shaped by my context where I've lived and I've experienced an environment where I feel some of these things aren't in place, right? I've lost family members, because I've lost family members who had, various ailments, and they went through the normal process of going to the hospital and trying to seek redress for this ailment or that ailment. And because they couldn't afford the medication, they were either turned back or they were given a substandard level. They were given a substandard, or a lower quality of medication that eventually did not solve the issue that they had, right? I just think that at a very basic level, these are the building blocks of a healthy society, to acknowledge that we are not all equally placed. And, and where we can, we should try to support and we should try to nurture the population, so to speak, to bring ourselves up to a minimum standard by which we can then go about our endeavors. Anyway, sorry.
I have a feeling that we could keep talking and talking and talking and talking. Trust me, there's so many directions we could go in this conversation. Not all of them controversial, and not all of them stuff that gets you in trouble, I promise. And we haven't even touched any of the stuff that gets you into trouble in this interview. But I just want to say thank you for coming on. I know that when I first invited you on the show, I didn't entirely tell you everything we're going to talk about, and I thrown some curveballs that you handle the expertly. Remind me one thing though. I should never tell a professor that I'm going to do a brief interview for 30 minutes ever again. It's never going to happen. just don't worry about it. I was thinking in my head that I was going to do like a short interview, but I think your answers alone to maybe one of the questions may be a lecture. So that's what it is. But, thank you for coming on.
Yeah,
thank you for giving your perspective on some of these issues. And, I'm sure we'll have further conversations about this. Maybe we'll invite you back and you might have like a and a bit of engagement with the audience, they might throw a few more curveballs at you and see how you like that.
Absolutely. You know what, Victor, and I hope this stays in, but I really appreciate you for bringing me on here. Thank you for this time. Thank you for sharing your platform with me for these hours. I've been, like I said, I've been watching your work, and I've subscribed to you, and I see the amount of work that you put in, and because we know each other on a personal level, and we're always talking about this. Honestly, I always thought to myself, you know what? I fancy myself coming on here. I don't know how it's gonna happen. I don't know when it's gonna happen, but like I would like to actually like just engage with you, and I really appreciate the questions that you've posed. I think that I also appreciate the exercise of it all. Like this is an exercise kind of thinking about your responses in real time, and you ask cutting questions that really it causes you to think, and it not only causes you to think, it causes you to you know what you want to say, but you're trying to articulate it in a way that is accessible and is also it also offers the best answer that you can provide at this particular time to your questions. So I don't know, like you're really good at this journalism stuff, because, and I always wonder, like, how are you a chemist? Because I think you're so journalistic, So
Yeah, I've heard
so
that quite a few times
and
before.
that in
I've
itself
heard
is a
that before.
product. Yeah, and that in itself is a product of all of the work that you put in before, which is what I always tell my students. Prior to now, that it really is. It speaks so well of you that you can exist in two spaces in this, like these, your professional life, and I don't know if you consider this your professional work, but whatever you consider this, the fact that you're able to exist in both worlds, it's a massive compliment to you. Like it's a huge skill set. Like it's so I do appreciate you for this, and yeah, I'm glad that we are friends, and I'm glad
There
that
we
we got to
go.
do
There we
this.
go. Thank you for listening. If you're back home, and for those of you who are new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe. Typically, we're diving a little bit deeper into the politics and having more in-depth conversations about politics. But I just like to have conversations with people. So today you've had cause to be. It just so happens that a conversation I would typically have with someone I know is something that we're we're putting out for you guys to enjoy. So thank you for joining. Don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.